we created them. Really consider that when you're trying to.
Where are we on attendance so far?
It all starts.
Give it a couple
We're
more
at
minutes.
50.
Now I can't hear anything.
Good morning, Chief. Good afternoon, Chief Counsel. How are you? I think you're muted.
He definitely is.
He looks great though, doesn't he?
It looks good.
I was up in our offices Monday, Adrian. It felt good just to be back, you know?
Yeah, I would
I
imagine.
think I'm up one day next week also up in Harrisburg. We'll see though.
Okay. We think a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Everybody will start straggling in.
Yeah, hold on. I got so many things from you.
All right. You let us know when you're ready. And the one change that we do have, Jody, is that Chairman Bolstein will not be able to provide any welcoming remarks. Chad will do that.
Okay.
So that's why we can afford to spend a couple of minutes waiting for attendance to increase.
Okay. Because I don't know. Oh, here we are.
Well, I'm glad that you can hear us, Chief Counsel. Welcome aboard.
You ready?
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Take it away.
Good afternoon. I welcome you to PHRC Roundtable discussion on sexual harassment. We will be dealing with a range of issues regarding sexual harassment in housing, from policies, procedures to domestic violence. We have a wonderful panel selected today to discuss the roundtable. At this present time, we're going to have an remarks from our Executive Director, Chad Lassiter.
Yes, good afternoon. I want to first and foremost thank Jody, as well as our Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property, Adrian Garcia, and all of the Planning Committee for putting this together. I'm very excited to be here in the moment. And also, I just want to welcome the viewing audience, as well as this amazing esteemed panelists. Each of the panelists you'll hear from is not just going to be their intellectual property that's going to be on display, but also their compassion, their passion, their dedication, and their overall commitment for fair housing and for justice under the law. Each of them are what I see as in the moment advocates for fair housing. From Stella Adams, from a historical standpoint, she's been doing this for a considerable period of time, to Melanie Teller, who's been doing this over the past 20 plus years, to Angela McGyver and all of the work she does in the Philadelphia catchment area, but throughout Southeastern PA and Eastern PA, and certainly Megan. So I'm really, really excited about what they're going to bring forth. Really excited that even in the midst of economic collapse and the pandemic that we're experiencing, that under the leadership of Director Garcia and the joint leadership of Jody Bradley and multiple others, that we decided to do this on Zoom. We were talking prior to coming on to the Zoom live, that in the moment we find ourselves in, everyone is going through some form of Zoom fatigue. So to the viewing audience, just want to once again welcome you in. Really looking forward to this really what's going to be an amazing panel. And once again, welcome to our PHRC Sexual Harassment Roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad, for your opening remarks. Right now, I'm going to introduce our panelists. First up, will be Stella Adams. Stella Adams is a civil rights professional with over 20 years of experience with civil rights enforcement. She has worked tirelessly to provide equal access and equal opportunity to all. Her specialties include fair housing investigation, fair lending investigations, includes fair housing investigations, fair lending, fair housing policies, fair lending policies, mortgage fraud investigations, analysis of impediment studies, foreclosures, prevention loss, mitigation, civil rights, education, and advocacy. Stella Adams is the founder and CEO of S.J. Adams Consulting, a full-service civil rights research and consulting firm located in Durham, North Carolina. S.J. Adams Consulting provides a broad range of services to nonprofit community-based organizations, government, and industry to assist them in meeting their fair housing, fair lending, diversity, and environmental justice goals. These services include fair housing lending, audits, fair housing planning, research, mystery shopping, civil rights investigations, mortgage fraud investigations, compliance programs, training programs, and independent assessments. S.J. Adams Consulting is dedicated to the creation of equal housing opportunity and equal access to financial services for all citizens regarding of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, marital status, family status, disability, or source of income. The next, I apologize, keep clicking off. The next would be Megan Comfort Heyman. Megan Comfort Heyman is the interim executive director of Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh. She is originally from Gaithersburg, Maryland, and she relocated to Pittsburgh, PA, to attend Carnegie Mellon University. She graduated from CMU in 2009 with a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture. Subsequently, she began at FHP as a Public Allies American Corp apprentice, and in 2010, she transitioned onto FHP staff as the intake specialist. She has now held every role within FHP. She is a product of Montgomery County, Maryland's groundbreaking exclusionary zoning policy, and she is a steward advocate of housing choice and opportunity. The next panelist would be Angela McIver. Angela McIver is a national leader and advocate for fair housing for all. Angela joined the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania in 2007 and Chief Executive Officer. In 2016, Angela was appointed to the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights. In 2018, she was elected to the Board of National Fair Housing Alliance. In 2019, Angela was designated the National Housing Fellow under Strong Families Commission. Angela delivers housing commentary on the radio show Turning Life Corners on WPPM 106.5 FM. She was featured on KYW News Radio, WHYY FM 90.9, WITF WURD 900 AM, WWDB 96.5 FM, NBC 10, Praise 107.9 FM, PBS NewsHour, Reveal Radio, One Reopening Philly Radio video event, and CNN. Angela has 29 years of experience and specializes in serving as a system analyst by developing custom business solutions, institutional and organizational networking, community partners, coalitions affecting adults and young and youth, and identifying social intersections and solutions. Currently, Angela is pursuing her licensures as an expert on trauma. Angela produced a two-time award-winning Independent Film Life Isn't Fair. And in 2018, she created the release an independent documentaries entitled Memoir of a Home, a short biography featuring residents and a historical account of their address and community. Angela produced in 2014, she was the recipient of the Willow Grove branch of the NAACP Humanitarian Award for Community Service. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Behavioral Science from Pennsylvania State University. She also earned a Master of Social Studies, Social Services, and a Master of Law and Social Policy from Bryn Mawr College. She enjoys a host of family and friends. And last but not least, Melody Taylor serves as a Regional Director of the Mid-Atlantic Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She serves the region in implementing programs and policies in all matters relating to fair housing, economic and opportunity, civil rights, and non-discrimination in the implementation of HUD programs. Melody has dedicated her life's work to fair housing, having spent the past 25 years in enforcement, educating, and developing policies. Melody's fair housing journey has taken her from local and national nonprofits to state, and most notably serving as a fair housing leader in the federal space. Notably, she has served as a senior advisor in the implementation of affirmatively furthering fair housing and relaunch of the national evidence in the host of landmark conciliation success, resulting in the production of over 1,500 affordable housing units in the state of Maryland, dismantling systems policies that impact marginalized communities and funding opportunities to increase the supply of accessibility in housing. And that will be our panelists for this afternoon, discussing topics. Next up, we have our own Adrian Garcia, who will serve as the moderator of the panel. Adrian?
Thank you, Jody. Great job. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited. I'm not going to lie, I'm a little nervous. We have a powerhouse panel. As I stated earlier, before we even got started, I have a tie on and I still feel underdressed in the company that we're going to be keeping today. But I'm excited and at the same time dismayed. Let's just put this in perspective for one moment. Home and what it means to us, and the ability to live there without judgment, the ability to be there in our refuge with our family, the ability to just be us, and to have that threatened by someone that has some semblance of power. This is one of the things that I always talk about when we talk about landlords. You know, I don't use that term. I use property manager. I use owner, because a landlord is you're just subjecting to that person. And so when you have that terminology and you are a single parent family, I grew up with my grandmother. I can't imagine what the home life would have been if she had gone through some of these. And I don't know that she hadn't, because I was with her since a young man. So sexual harassment in housing is as old as time itself. And we've made a lot of advancements in civil rights, yet this continues to permeate. This continues to come through. And in the light of COVID, even more so. It's increased. It's become pervasive, and it's become blatant. And so we know this to be true, and we know that this presents not only effects to the individual, which can be women, but women of color, certainly, women that are aging or the elderly, single parent families, women that don't conform to gender, any marginalized population is usually the prime victim. And as we've heard, many of us that have have investigated these cases, we have heard, I need to keep a roof over my kid's head.
Mhm.
That is not a choice. And so what is important about what we're going to be discussing today is we're going to be looking at this from a 30,000-foot view, from the perspective of civil rights, from the perspective of government agencies looking at this issue and putting initiatives in place, from looking it down to the regional areas, and also the correlation between some of the comparative links between the behavior in a sexual harassment incident and that of domestic violence. Because these both are power struggles. And both of these have increased since COVID. So it's important for us as housing advocates, enforcement agencies, social service entities, municipal governments, magistrates, whoever's on this call, it is important for us to look at this from all aspects, including trauma, so that we know how to address these concerns, advocate for changes in laws, so that we can ensure that people are able to live at home in peace in the home that they choose. And that's why we want to get together today. So as I started saying, we're going to look at this from a 30,000-foot view, from a historical perspective, from a civil rights perspective. And for that, I'm going to call on our first panelist, Stella Adams.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to try to screen share. I want to echo while I'm getting this together. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I want to stress that everything that Adrian said is exactly true, except just on steroids. What we're going to see in the next month, the CDC moratorium is supposed to end on December 31st. I want you to anticipate, I want you to visualize, I want you to understand what that means. So we have gone without an extension of the federal funds for extra unemployment. We have run out of funds, and you have to understand that the funds that the state received from that first package, from that first package is going to run out. Y'all forgive me, my battery's low. Okay, we're good now. Is that first package is going to go out, right? Is running out, and the federal, the money that went to the states, that the states are going to use to help with rental assistance, to help with foreclosure prevention, the date that expires is, guess when? December 31st. December 31st is the day before New Year's Eve. Think about what is going to happen in these next 6 weeks. We have Thanksgiving. We have Christmas. We have a lack of abundance. We have unsurety about the likelihood that a new package of relief is going to happen between now and December 31st is like almost nil. So you're looking at a hard deadline. And then all these programs will end because the resources that were given to the states and the local government said you had to spend the money. You don't have an option of like holding a little bit back for January. You have to spend the money by December the 31st. So that's a hard deadline. With no relief coming, where people may be 3 to 6 months behind on their rent or mortgage, looking for a lifeline. You panic. You're in a stressful situation, and then you face sexual harassment. So what is sexual harassment? And I'm going to talk about this in generalized terms because you've got the experts on the things that I'm going to talk about behind me, almost in the order of these slides. So I'm just going to run through it. But is a type, it involves explicit or implicit sexual overtones, including unwelcomed and inappropriate promises of rewards in exchange for sexual favors. Legally, it's called hostile environment or a quid pro quo. This for that. I will give you, you can stay here in the winter, in the coldness of the winter, in the height of the COVID, but you got to give me some sexual favors in advance. One thing I want to stress, that it's a range of things. It does not have to be all of these things. It does not have to be a physical assault. It just needs to be a verbal, uncomfortable interchange, implications, and those types of things. These are the things that women and men, because the victim can be a man. Sexual harassment in housing can be perpetrated by and I use the word landlords, but I will not use it again. That's the lesson. I learn something every time I do something. That's my lesson learned. Property managers, maintenance workers, loan officers. When you're talking about foreclosures, you think, oh, there's no opportunity for sexual harassment. That is not true. In my experience, I met someone who told me about, in the late 20th century, because we're in the 21st century now, that's the only reason I can't record it. They call them leg loans. That they will make leg loans, and that's what they call sexual harassment in the lending business. Leg loans. That's the term. And they teach it, and they were teaching it as an option to men as late as the 1990s. And I would like to say it was the early 1990s, but it was not. It was the late 1990s. Harassment can occur whether or not there are witnesses to it. You don't have to have a witness to be believed. That's why I have this picture of the Me Too there. Okay, your word should be sufficient for the investigation to begin. Doesn't mean that the investigation will find enough evidence to support it, but it's certainly your word is sufficient for the investigation. The victim and the perpetrator can be of any gender. Women can harass women, women can harass men, men can harass women, men can harass men. We live in a non-conforming people can experience sexual harassment. People with different gender identities, transgender people are often subjected to sexual harassment. And so we need to not have in our mind who is a perpetrator and who is a victim. The perpetrator does not have to be of the opposite sex, and sexual harassment does not have to be physical. These are the things I want you to know when you leave here about sexual harassment. Now, these are stories, these are recently reported stories of sexual harassment that have occurred in communities. And I don't know if you had enough time to read that previous one, but I do want you to be able to read it. you ask if you can get out of your lease. Here's a situation where she just wanted to get out of her lease without hurting her credit. And she was told that she could pay her debt, work off her debt on her back. I wish I could tell you that this was new or shockingly unfamiliar. It's not. What has happened in the past, what is different now than in the past, is that the most vulnerable women in our community, the most vulnerable victims in our community have been experiencing this all along. That is your vulnerable public housing, low income men and women, transgender youth coming out of foster care, going on, becoming adults. These most vulnerable populations have been experiencing this for generations. And that's where we have, as a community, had most of our cases. What's different about COVID is that people who have had good jobs are now without jobs, or they have lower income than they're accustomed to. And they have now become part, because of the COVID, they are now part of this vulnerable population for the first time. And they're experiencing these things that they otherwise would not have known about or experienced or had knowledge of anyone who had that experience. These cases here are out of Hawaii. But what I want you to pay attention to is that they were not filed with the Hawaii Human Relations Commission. They were filed with the State Commission on the Status of Women. And many times these type of complaints are filed or reported to the Council of Women or the Domestic Violence or the Homeless Shelter for Women and Children. That's where these things get reported. And sometimes our outreach doesn't reach those communities. I am happy to see that we have the domestic violence community represented on this panel, because that is one of the places where these will come in. I can't imagine what it's like. You're looking for affordable housing options. You don't even live there, right? You're trying to find a place to live. And then he sends you a lewd picture. And I think you all know what he sent a picture of. It doesn't need to be more explicit. And then you tell somebody she can come over and spoon him instead. Now, y'all in Pennsylvania, y'all know about this spooning thing, right? This is unconscionable. But this is among 10 cases since April. 10 cases that have been submitted to the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women since April. And so this is not without it. And then we always have to think about, what is this doing to women? You find your victims where they are, but the impact of being exposed to this kind of trauma, and I'm glad that Angela's here to talk us through what that is like and what that means. And we have to think about that, and we have to be aware that we should be looking and listening and preparing our state and our organizations, the women's groups and the women's and the public, of what this impending crisis is going to be, because January is the cold dead of winter. I have children. There's COVID out there. It's the dead cold of winter. I have two choices. I have two choices. between a rock and a hard place. I maintain my physical and mental dignity and say no. And my children and I are on the streets. The trauma, the drama of having to make that choice, right? That's sexual harassment, refusal to participate in the quid pro quo. That's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. My children and I end up in the shelter. That's the damages that we suffer. That's the psychological damage that we suffer because I made that choice. Or I make the choice to spoon, assaulting my physical and mental dignity. But my children have a place to stay. That too is sexual harassment and a violation of the law. Both of those. I don't have a good option here. There's no good option. The victim doesn't, you have to keep your eye as investigators on the perpetrator. He is the person. Don't ask why I made the choice I made. That's not the point. The point is the perpetrator committed the assault on my dignity. Either way, that's who you investigate. Not my choice. It wasn't a choice. He or she put me in a position that was adverse to my dignity. He or she put me in a position adverse to my position, to my dignity. They committed a discriminatory act against me. And always keep the focus on that, not on the untenable position that the victim was put in. With that, I'm gonna turn it back over.
Thank you, Stella. I really appreciate your words. Powerful indeed. So you get a sense as we begin to get into this a little bit more, how this comes together and how this perpetrates and it affects. And Stella mentioned how a lot of these complaints end up going to the domestic violence centers and counselors. And there's a very good reason for that. And that's because there's a pattern of behavior that is similar in both sexual harassment and domestic violence. And so the chief among those is power, or the lack thereof, the lack of choice, as Stella mentioned. So to get into that a little bit more, we have our second panelist, Megan Confer-Hammond.
Thank you, Adrian. My name is Megan Confer-Hammond. I am the Interim Executive Director at the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh, and that will be moving forward in a final way as my board's 6-month probation ends up. But before we get into a very serious, further in this conversation that we're having, we all understand that we are sitting as a society on the powder keg right now. We're certainly not, I'm not going to discuss politics in any way, but I will mention that the Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman, comes out of Pittsburgh, comes out of the greater Pittsburgh area. If you've seen him on the news, the only thing I want to put to the group in terms of how Lieutenant John Fetterman has been in the news recently is to let me know, let us know in this group, are you on the side of sheets versus wall? And as we have Pennsylvania represented throughout this entire conversation here, coming from Maryland originally, I go for 7-Eleven. But I've heard that there's a lot of country fair fans too, with my wife up in Erie. So I invite anyone, put in, where you're coming from, as Pennsylvania as a whole is dealing with this very important topic that John Fetterman has put out. How do we support our best, gasoline or of getting gas, food? You all know that's where the best food is at the gas station. So to go from this very important topic, right? See, we have a lot of East Pennsylvania in here. I'm looking at Wawa coming up on the text. I mean, come on, Sheet people. I mean, Sheet has the cheese balls. Sheet has, Wawa's real well represented in PHRC.
Excuse me, Megan. I just want to stop you for 1 second, please. Yeah. I'm getting messages that they're having some difficulty hearing you.
Really?
I don't know if you could maybe turn your volume up, or if they're getting a little bit of an echo. If you could just speak a little bit louder into your microphone, please.
I hear you. Let me try something here. I'm using a FM device. Is that better at all?
You sound a little louder now. I thought
Okay.
that might have been causing the feedback, but if you're talking into it a little bit better, we can hear you. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I use an FM system with my hearing aid, and sometimes I'm not quite sure where the microphone is at. So certainly let me know if there's any other concerns hearing me. So now I see the sheets coming out. So now they can hear me. Sheet versus Wawa, put in chat, and one day we'll do an official poll and figure this out. So, but to pivot right back into this very serious conversation, this concept, because the reason that we're here in this conversation, having this discussion, is that, to Stella's point and what's happening is we are facing a very hard and real deadline on January 1st. And it is crucial that we are prepared, because the amazing thing about the fair housing laws, in my experience, is that we provide an absolute important aspect for violence in the homes to have a civil rights opportunity, to have a civil opportunity in order to fight back, to push back. And what we do in the civil space is about stopping that violence, because that violence is looking at escalating into a situation of criminal behavior. I've been in fair housing conferences and conversations for the past decade in which we are constantly trying to understand, is this a civil or criminal act that we're addressing? And myself, I'm sure Angela as well, and the rest of us who get those calls of the individuals who are reporting sexual harassment, domestic violence, and other types of violence in the home, doing the investigation part of it, doing the pushback within the legal framework is next to impossible when you're speaking to someone who is trying to stop what they know is going to happen, what we know is going to happen, which is continued or escalated violence against them. But when they're calling the police and when we're having these conversations, until that act of violence occurs, there can be no intervention. And we are that intervention. We are the people they are calling in order to stop the violence that we all can see happening. So what I want to talk about, in the sense of what sexual harassment in housing is. Sexual harassment is just that, violence in the home. And so there's two other crucial pieces of understanding within fair housing is violence within the home, is domestic violence. And I'm also going to touch on the concept of tenant-on-tenant harassment and what we're seeing today. And so what happens is that as we're getting these calls that are coming in, we recognize that our criminal justice system is going to require that crime to occur. Or at the very least, we have to show a provable intent, an intent we can substantiate on a legal basis. But our callers are in a place where making that case can be next to impossible when we're talking about fact patterns where we have to get 6 or 8 women in order to speak to the same fact pattern. How are we going to help this individual caller on the phone right now who is addressing that violence in the household? So to touch on domestic violence is to understand that, and I'll certainly see questions in the chat if anything comes up, but the most common knowledge about domestic violence in fair housing is certainly the Violence Against Women Act protections that exist in subsidized housing. And additionally, in the past decade, we've seen litigation and HUD guidance on municipal nuisance ordinances that prevent survivors of domestic violence or who are victims at the time of calling into the police in order to access criminal intervention because of that threat of eviction, because of that threat of being deemed a nuisance property and losing access to assistance while they're in the act of that violence. But right now, we are in the midst of a pandemic. We are in the midst of a powder keg. And on top of all of it, we are quarantined at home. We can't leave our homes. And so survivors of domestic violence or victims who are undergoing it right now need fair housing protections in the private market. And what we're seeing is when we look at the protections that are necessary, to speak about what Stella was pointing out in her PowerPoint, is that there needs to be release from their lease in order to move away from a location that the abuser is not aware of or can't find them, or that the survivor is not accountable for property damage done by the abuser, or for example, to change the locks at no cost for the survivor once they have had the abuser removed from the property. Those are all cases that the FHP has advocated on behalf of. And so when we look at it within the concept of protected classes, we understand that on the basis of sex, we look at Pennsylvania specifically. So we'll say, 37.7% of women in Pennsylvania are going to be domestic violence victims compared to about 27.5% of men. But what I want to call out to understand in Pennsylvania specifically is the prevalence, the availability, and the readiness of the abusers to have access to guns. And so in Pennsylvania, on that same data set, is that 72%, sorry, is that my phone? Is that 72% of all murder suicides regarding domestic violence or intimate partner violence, 94% of the victims are women. And I bring this up because of the prevalence of murder suicides, the prevalence of the ultimate violence of ultimately death in domestic violence situations, in situations of violence in housing, are prevalent in Pennsylvania. And I will point to, if anyone recalls, time is moving both at a warp speed and incredibly slowly right now. But who remembers 2018, Masonville, Pennsylvania? Masonville is what, an hour and a half north of Pittsburgh? And the municipal building on Masonville was locked down. It was locked down because of a shooting, because a shooter was on the loose. He shot 2 or 3 people, including the police. And why was he shooting? He was shooting because his ex-wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife, was pursuing the protection from abuse order against him. And he went and he shot her, other people at the building. And then I will never forget seeing those news articles, reading those news articles, and seeing that still as a society, as a community, we saw witnesses who spoke to how much he just loved her, how much he just cared about her. And so as a society, we have to struggle with understanding the harm of domestic violence, but our obligation here and our capacity here, our expertise here, is the ability to put the wall in between the survivor and the abuser, the ability to make that home environment, that space, a space where we can mitigate the escalating violence that we are all too aware that's going to happen, as a means of understanding that it's not about getting to a point that becomes criminal. It's about using civil rights to stop acts based on sex, based on hate, and based on so many other protected classes. And I will say is that additionally to underscore Stella's point, is that on the basis of sex is expanded amongst the fair housing protections as we consider survivors of domestic violence. And so we can look at populations based on national origin. Specifically in the greater Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania area, we have a sizable refugee population. There are data sets that support that both the domestic violence that occurs in refugee camps prior to placement in the United States, as well as cultural basis from which the refugees are coming from different Southern American countries, as well as Somalia, and that there is a preponderance of domestic violence when you additionally include LEP, or limited English proficiency, as an additional barrier for these survivors in accessing the society around them and the ability in order to get additional services. We've seen the need for protections based on the basis of sex, but within sexual orientation. And so a gay male couple in which one of the men, and the preponderance of evidence that shows that within homosexual relationships, because when any group of people, when any vulnerable class, when any protected class is pushed down by discrimination, we are pushed underground and hidden from the rest of society, that allows for abuse amongst each other, to each other, because of the hidden nature of our identity within the modern society. And so as we look at gay relationships and the data that shows domestic violence within gay relationships is that a gay man successfully had his boyfriend removed with the PSA, but who now needed to have the locks changed. And certainly we understand that when there's a financial component involved, we look at the relative size, the relative nature, the ability of fair housing to have the landlord. It's not about making a housing provider go out of business or bankrupt. It's a matter of their ability, their financial ability to pay for what is ultimately nominal for the very protection in what can be life or death in this conversation. So the conversation for this gay man was regarding his need for the property to change the locks and not to charge him as they would otherwise within their policy, because the lock change was removing an abuser who had a key to access the unit to protect the health and safety of the current tenant, who was a survivor of domestic violence by the nature of his immutable identity or his protected class. And so we've been successful at FHP in pushing these fact patterns to ensure that the most important part of our lives, which we all here agree, housing is all too often downplayed in the mainstream media, in the conversations of when we're talking about civil rights, the conversations we need to do in order to understand how we can access police reform, criminal justice reform, employment reform, school reform. To me, it starts with housing. It starts with where we live, and it starts with living in an environment in which we can be safe in order to pursue our employment, our education, and so on. And so domestic violence based on the fact pattern of the survivor calling can apply to a host of protected classes, depending on what the immutable identity of that caller is. And then we all have that need on that timely response, that timely turnaround, because we are talking about acts of violence that is putting someone at physical risk. And so I will explain that. What we just did a couple of weeks ago is that at FHP, we filed in federal court on a fact pattern of fair housing and domestic violence on the basis of sex. A woman was stalked for months by her abuser. She had him removed from the property, and he continued to stalk her in violation of his PSA. He was put on probation on his PSA, and immediately when the PSA stopped, his stalking escalated again. He had physically beaten her in the past. He had access to a gun at his parents' house where he was staying. And so the survivor, our client, knew the risk she was taking remaining in the property was literally life or death. And I will say that fair housing shouldn't be a matter of life or death. The need of our clients, the need of our complainants shouldn't be a matter of life or death in order for civil rights to intervene. But when we're talking about violence in the home, we are talking about life and death. And what happened is that this landlord had a clause in his lease that accelerated the payment of rent for the entire lease term, effectively creating a balloon payment if you vacated the lease early. Now, you may understand that with the Pennsylvania's Landlord-Tenant Act of 1951, there is a legal obligation within landlord-tenant law for a landlord to mitigate their damages in the instances of a tenant leaving the lease early. But this landlord was steamrolling his own legal obligation, resulting in a balloon payment of thousands of dollars on top of the survivor's head, while she's dealing with stalking that's escalated, and she's lost 2 jobs over it. And so she finally fled when she called the police after she saw him again at the unit, and the police couldn't intervene unless they caught him on the property. And of course, he had fled anytime she had called the police. He was not there at the time that the police arrived. And so when she finally fled, with some 2-3 months left on her lease, she was hit with $8,000 in bills for this landlord charging her for fleeing for her safety. And her abuser's abuse is so extreme that he found her at the domestic violence shelter that she fled to. The shelter went on lockdown, and she had to flee again.
Did we lose her?
And to a second shelter. And so I think, I'm sorry, am I here?
You froze for a second, Megan. So you said the center went on lockdown and then you went on freeze for about 30 seconds.
I apologize for that. It's technology, I just can't win it. So the shelter went on lockdown. And so those of us who pick up the phones and talk to the clients who are going through violence in the home, who are going through these instances in which they can't get away from someone chasing them in violence, is critical to be able to turn around a fact pattern that pursues the housing provider's obligation to protect us in cases of hate, in cases of when our identity is the basis of being pursued with violence. And I'll share in this like-minded group. I understand that this is PHRC as a whole. We're all FIPS and FAPS partners here. And I will share as a person, as an individual. I come from a place of domestic violence in the home, and it wasn't until we were homeless in a converted farmhouse in West Virginia with friends that my mom was able to flee her abuser. And when she fled as a single mom with 3 children at the time, it was HUD subsidy housing in inclusive zoning policies in Montgomery County, Maryland, that gave her the frame of mind to get her master's degree and her kids the frame of mind to find a place of success and a place to win in life, despite all of the oppression that we face for our identity. And so I take this role that we all share, as we all do, critically to the point of what we are as a bulwark against our clients' needs for safety, our clients' needs to be able to be protected and to live in peace, so as to find the life that we have the opportunity to live and to have the opportunity to live it. And so I want to touch on one more piece as we discuss this concept of violence in the home, because I can't enumerate it enough of what we both understand is that we are stuck at home with each other. We are stuck, and I am grateful eternally that my wife and I love each other, because being stuck at home has made any divisions that we have worse, and we didn't have that many to begin with. And those of us that are stuck at home with an abuser who can't flee an abuser are going to be calling us in January. They are going to be in need, because the move to evict and the homelessness crisis that's coming will in fact hit, as we expect no intervention on that. And so from a civil rights perspective, I also want to point on the concept of tenant-on-tenant harassment. So we understand, and I'm getting the calls, I'm sure many of you have heard these calls, tenants are fighting, tenants are arguing, tenants are swinging fists, tenants are going back into their apartment and grabbing a baseball bat to come back out into the hallway. These are the calls that I'm seeing. Landlords have an obligation, that is the cost of doing business, the obligation of doing business is to intervene in tenant-on-tenant harassment based on a protected class. And I will hold up and appreciate, and we're going to issue a notice, and I'll certainly send to everyone here, is that in the past 2 weeks, we recently settled a fair housing complaint with our HUD investigator. And the amazing part of this conciliation is that the fact pattern wasn't about tenant-on-tenant harassment, but this landlord, who serves hundreds, if not thousands of units in the greater Pittsburgh region, had a clause in his lease that said he was not obligated to tenant-on-tenant harassment based on a protected class. The tenant had to pursue criminal or civil charges as a magistrate, bring that winning back to the landlord in order for the landlord to pursue an obligation to intervene. This is a federal obligation that is backed up by HUD guidance, that tenant-on-tenant harassment by protected class is allowing hate in our homes, hate in our environment, and our ability to broadcast the news to landlords now, because there is such a environment in Pennsylvania where landlords and housing providers are in that position of power because of difficulty with tenants accessing landlord-tenant rights, is that when we are in the civil rights space, that Pennsylvania landlords, if you're in East, Center, or West, we hear them say, I am not letting government into my business, into my decision-making. Guess what? Civil rights is. Civil rights is already here. We fought and we bled and we died in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s. And the obligation here is to recognize that landlords, public or private, have a responsibility to intervene when it is based on hate, based on a protected class, and violence is occurring in the home. And the very, very baseline is that those landlords aren't the perpetrators of that violence. That is the very fundamental truth where we should be at. And the next truth is that they cannot allow violence based on protected classes to occur in the homes that they operate as a business. And so I simply sort of lost track of where we are at time and have gone over, but I appreciate the chance to speak to what I am hearing on my phones, what we are working as an agency, as you all are working as an agency to be ready in the space of where tenant landlord rights are underwater as we look at what's happened with the pandemic, with the space of the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, the disproportionate nature that the pandemic is having on protected classes, on communities of color, of people with disabilities, of survivors of domestic violence, is that our need to be the bulwark to protect tenant civil rights as we are facing an escalating violence in our homes is only going to grow as we go into the new year. And I appreciate everyone's work and shared efforts in protecting the Commonwealth against that violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you very much. And so one would only have to look back in history and see as we begin to tackle this subject matter as far as it goes, and to realize that one piece of our civil rights hasn't moved. And a lot of people know this already, right? But those marginalized communities are at the end and at the brunt end of the violence, domestic violence, and sexual harassment. And there's that power dynamic and the subjugation and oppression. So what we want to do is, what can we do, right? Is it all bad news? Well, I know that the Department of Justice and Department of Housing and Urban Development began looking at this a couple of years ago. They started really focusing on sexual harassment and the causes and investigations and education and outreach. And so I was interested in finding out, and as I'm sure you all are, finding out how that's going, but also now in light of COVID, what we're seeing. And so for that, we have joining us Melody Taylor, and we're going to go ahead and pass it on to her.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian, Stella, Megan, for the passion that you bring to this topic. I can't express enough that we have to continue to stay vigilant, pay attention, respond to the calls, respond to people. We have to build a community around this initiative and the efforts. It's holistic. Glad that Angela's here to talk about trauma. Trauma goes just, it's beyond when we're looking at sexual harassment. Megan, you brought up domestic violence. When I listen to everyone, I think about the trauma of race, being a person of color in this country and going through what we're going through right now. And when you put it all, you layer it all up. We're in an experience right now. And so it's really important that we have that, we wear that lens when we're conducting investigations. So what I hope to do today is to kind of bring what they've each talked about full circle in terms of some of the specifics that we're looking for when we're talking about sexual harassment and investigations. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Megan brought up VAWA and domestic violence. There's a case that we handled several years ago. It was a secretary-initiated case, HUD versus Norristown Municipality, and where we partnered with the ACLU. There's a toolkit, there's a letter out there. If you get an opportunity as an investigator or practitioner in this field, you should take a look at it. Look at the case and the outcomes in that case. It could absolutely help guide you through investigating a case such as that. So just quickly wanted to share with you a couple of things. And as Adrian mentioned, the Assistant Secretary, Ana Maria Farias, for the past several years has taken a very personal and position and commitment to making sure that internal to the department, external to our partners, that we have a commitment to engaging in and investigating thoroughly cases of sexual harassment. No one should have to choose roof overhead versus having to give their body to someone because they have power and authority. And so it's really important to me, for the region, for the country, that we pay particular attention to how we're investigating these cases. So we're wanting to ensure that we're increasing awareness, right? Through the National Fair Housing Training Academy, we've had 2 fair housing forums. We want to prepare practitioners to be able to investigate these cases and to ensure that survivors of sexual harassment and others in their lives are able to report these incidents to HUD, to FIPS, to FAPS, to DOJ. And we have to work together to do that, to stop sexual harassment from happening to other residents. Couple of other things I want to share about that is just as an investigator, it's important that when you're responding to someone who's a victim of sexual harassment, disposition matters, right? When you're dealing with someone who has had a recent experience, your sensitivities have to play into part. You have to be responsive. You need to nail down telephone numbers, addresses, email, because we can lose sight of people very easily. I just had a case out of West Virginia, repeat. The individual alleged that she was raped. Her perpetrator is still near. He still was on the property. And in her angst of not having it repeat again, she left the property. She gave us a call, filed a complaint, but maintaining contact with her has been difficult. So you want to make sure that at the point that you do get a call or you are able to speak with a victim, that you get other numbers, people that a next door neighbor, if they have a number, get an email address, make sure you have good contact information when you're conducting these investigations, because the loss of the complainant can happen very quickly.
Ms. Taylor, whenever you're ready, I can go to your presentation.
Okay, I'm kind of now talking.
However you want to flow, however you want to flow.
Thank you. Secondly, we have been working with the AUSA's office. I know many of you may have participated in the sexual harassment roundtable that we facilitated. That was purposed so that we could begin to work with a broader group, a broader cross-section of stakeholders, making sure that we're in contact with law enforcement, health and human services, with churches and others, where we can actually connect the individual to some services. For example, the case that we had in West Virginia, we elicited the support of Southwestern Pennsylvania Legal Services to work on behalf of the complainant. And so if you are a FIP agency and you have complaints that are coming in and you're filing it with us, or vice versa, FAP agencies, we encourage you to reach out to your partner agencies to make sure that we're giving the complainant the full support necessary in order to move their investigation forward. Many of you may know that we have a sexual harassment toolkit that's out there that's purposed for the housing authorities, right? So housing authorities have a duty and responsibility that if sexual harassment is being reported to them, they must respond. In a case where a housing authority is aware that sexual harassment is occurring and they do nothing, HUD will pursue the housing authority as a responsible party as well. There are sanctions that get placed upon the housing authority, HAP contracts that they have in the event that they see something and do nothing. So we're very serious about holding housing authorities to the fire as well. And then other resources that are available are the PSAs. We have a host of podcasts. The National Fair Housing Alliance was funded to do podcasts and national media PSAs and print ads that are helpful and are available to everyone just to educate your community and bring about awareness to this. In fiscal year 19 and 20, and going into this fiscal year, about 15% of HUD's inventory has resulted in sexual harassment complaint filings. Was listening to Megan and Adrian talk about the calls that are coming in. And I pulled numbers from the region. We've had a 42% spike in the number of calls that are coming in. And as Megan talked about, it's a direct correlation, I fully believe, with the climate that we're in, right? People are at home. There is violence. There are things that are happening. People are able to see things that they were unable to see before when they were out going to work. The loss of jobs, the economic downturn, all those things are and do matter. And I fully believe that that's contributed to some of the uptick that we've had in the complaints that are being filed. Just wanted to mention a recent case that we settled, cases entitled Sierra Watson versus People Encouraging People. Case settled for $7,000, but I wanted to bring this case to your attention because when we investigated it, or when the call came in, the complainant alleged she was in a homeless shelter, and she was being victimized by her case manager. And so again, if we're thinking about what's going on now, people are losing jobs, they're losing their housing, the eviction rates are up. The next stop for a number of people are in these hotels. And in rural America, it's serious and pervasive, where folks are being placed in these hotels, one-room hotels with families and children, having nowhere else to go. And so this individual was placed in a hotel. Her case manager, the person who holds everything about her life, decides to sexually harass her and puts her in a position of either acquiescing to his advances or being made homeless. And again, we have to respond to these kinds of cases timely and quickly. So there are no opportunities as investigators to hold off on investigating these cases. When the allegations come in, we have to respond immediately, and we cannot delay our investigations, because the opportunity to lose an individual, again, if she had not contacted, if we had not responded accordingly, the possibility that we could have lost this complainant and she could have been exposed to other incidents of sexual harassment is very likely. So I stress very highly that our response and reactions to cases is critically important. But again, there's much work that we have done and we need to continue to do. The cases in West Virginia, again, paying attention to the footprint throughout the region, in the jurisdiction or service area that you're working in. The case that we had in West Virginia, which was filed in tandem with DOJ as a pattern and practice case. So that's a resource. When you believe, or if you believe that there are cases beyond one victim, and I'm a full believer that if it happens once, there's nothing new under the sun. It has likely happened on other occasions. And in the case that we filed in West Virginia, it happened on several occasions. The victim was raped by the property manager with her children in the unit. And you guys have probably heard me tell this story on countless occasions because it's egregious and it's painstaking to repeat. But I bring it to your attention because the same individual, DOJ was able to settle the case. There were monetary awards made to the complainants. And the property manager was, he was unable to manage rental properties to perpetuity, right? Well, he became very savvy. So his property was transferred over to his son. His son now manages the property. He now lives on the property. Mr. Walden is his name. A recent allegation came in yet again, where the victim alleged another victim alleged that she was raped by this individual. And he still resides on the property, has violated the consent decree by DOJ. Again, just paying attention to the complainant, the foot pattern of the perpetrators. A secretary-initiated complaint in May was filed against, yet again, against this particular individual, and we're working in tandem with DOJ to pursue this matter. I bring this case up again also because the criminal function of a sexual harassment case, right? The victim alleged that she had been raped, and the investigators on this case have reached out to the police department, right, to validate things, to make sure that she's safe. She actually fled her unit, abandoned all her things, and moved away. So we're having to work through social services, working through, she was able to get legal representation. Again, really important to make sure that you're maintaining the individual's contact information, neighbors' contact information. Just staying connected to the complainant is critically important. Stella mentioned the types of prohibited conduct under sexual harassment. So quid pro quo, which is something for something. And it occurs when a housing provider requires a person to submit to an unwelcome advance. And then hostile environment, which is what we've been seeing more of in the cases that have come through our office. Just the unwelcome sexual conduct that can interfere with one's freedom and opportunity to live freely in a particular dwelling. So you want to, when a complaint is filed, you want to make sure you're asking the right questions, that you're identifying the right violations when investigating a complaint of this nature. Some examples of quid pro quo, apartment is still available if you, right? You can, the ... So when you're conducting an investigation and you're asking questions, make sure that when you're talking to the complainant, you want them to complete sentences. What did something happen for something? Oftentimes, victims are unable to give you the full story in one interview. You may have to schedule multiple interviews in order to piecemeal the story together to conduct the investigation. So be sensitive to those things. As Stella mentioned, there are things that are happening to victims that are explicit and things that you probably don't want to say, that you would not say to another person. But you have to get into the weeds on these kinds of things when you're conducting an investigation. And so if it requires that you do it in tandem with someone who's more seasoned in conducting interviews, you should make sure that you plan and strategize on how you're going to conduct the investigation. But you want to make sure that you're getting complete information so that you're able to get the individual to safety first and foremost. And you want to make sure that you're maintaining some contact with the complainant. And just really quickly, just in terms of the hostile environment, again, putting on your investigator lenses here, you want to take into consideration the things that can happen, for in a hostile environment. We've had cases as egregious as an individual who may show body parts. The notion that text messaging happens, right? And there's people send things via text messages. As an investigator, what do you need to, you want to try and maintain chain of custody. So when you're securing text messages, you want to try and have the individual send you the text messages. If you could maintain a copy of it, you may have to reach out to one of the communications providers to secure the text messages. So as an agency, you want to make sure that you have practices in place and protocols in place so that you can secure it, because oftentimes it is the only piece of evidence that we have that could get us to settlement or to getting remedies in a complaint. And so you want to be able to make sure as an agency you have protocols in place to do so. And then finally, retaliation does happen, right? So we know that individuals who may have experienced sexual harassment and thereafter they file a complaint, and then the landlord or whomever will retaliate against them. Oftentimes eviction is something that happens. We see that in large part. Again, you want to make sure that as the investigator, you have full information, that you're able to secure the individual. And that holistic approach that I talked about earlier is critically important. Police departments, health and human services, making sure that your agency has access to individuals like that so that you're helping the complainant and that you're preserving their right so that retaliation doesn't occur. And then I just want to bring to your attention quickly the difference between cases that come in through DOJ and to HUD, right? So HUD is able to investigate a single issue case. We're also able to investigate pattern and practice cases as well. DOJ will only investigate pattern and practice cases. They will take on an individual case that comes into their office if they believe that they have the ability to pick up other claimants in a particular case. So we've been working very closely with DOJ on these cases. I know in the western part of Pennsylvania, there's been increased interest. Southwestern, FHP and others have had increased cases that have come in. And so we've been working very closely with DOJ in that area of the state, in the District of Columbia and in other places. So we've been working very closely with DOJ on ensuring that if there are patterns of practice that we're working collectively to do so. Now, I would just encourage you as FIPS and as FAPS, if we have FAPS on the call, oftentimes you will, some FAPS have picked up the phone to call DOJ and to refer a case, and they'll have a case referred to HUD. That coordination of effort is critically important, right? Again, we don't want to lose the complainant through process glitches. And so you want to make sure if your investigators or your FAP managers, FIP managers, that they're in full communication with HUD regarding how cases are filed or where the case is going to go in an effort to not to lose anyone. And then I'm going to close out with just referring folks to our website, so you have resource materials. If you have an opportunity, if you did not participate in the sexual harassment roundtables that we had, take a look at those. Again, really want to make sure that we're giving our investigators and practitioners resources to investigate these cases. It's an emotional, heart-wrenching in most part, but you have to show up as a neutral fact finder, which is critically important, right? And your objective is to get the evidence, to obtain evidence, to get the complainant to safety and security so that you can move the case as quickly as possible to get to resolution. So I'll take questions, I guess, when we get to the end, but again, wanted to give some perspective to how investigations should be handled and things that we should consider. And then I'm going to make this last point. We are all working remotely in this remote environment, and how you're investigating your cases remotely, right? You're not on the ground. No one's up close and personal. You're not knocking on doors, right? So in West Virginia, when we had the case, we sent out 800 letters. We knocked on doors. We showed up. This new case that I have that's in West Virginia, I'm not knocking on doors. I can't show up. So how are you conducting your investigations? What are some of the ways and mechanisms that you're using technology to be able to get your investigations to close? So it does require some coordination. It requires partnering and looking for those innovations in being able to do your investigations. A couple of things that we've adopted at HUD, picked up DocuSign, right? So you can actually get complaints signed off on. We've expanded our services with Westlaw. We had some limited abilities to use Westlaw, but we're using Westlaw more expansively, which will allow us to do greater investigations on an individual. Westlaw will allow you to get telephone numbers and addresses. And so in your data document requests from a respondent, they may give you a list of names, but you could pull, use Westlaw to be able to get greater information to try and make contact with some of your complainants or other aggrieved parties. So I ask you to think about, the environment and climate that we're in, and think through your investigations very thoroughly. And we're always obviously here to give technical assistance, but wanted to give some perspective about how we look at the investigation. So I'll stop there because I'll talk all day. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Really appreciate that insight. And I want to reiterate some points that you made, which is disposition is everything. And I've said this before, we are in the position that if we are not careful, we will re-victimize an individual that's gone through some trauma. And so we must take that neutral stance and take our time with some of these cases, because very, very often you will not get the information the first time out. It'll take 30 minutes just to get comfortable enough to even utter the first couple of words of the trauma that's being experienced. So we do have to practice some patience on there, because there's a lot of trauma that happens, and not just to the individual, but to also the extended family that lives in the home. And so to talk a little bit more about that,
Traumatized.
we are going to have Angela MacGyver talk to us a little bit about the trauma involved with these sexual harassment cases. Angela?
Thank you so much to PHRC for this platform, and to staff at PHRC. It's really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk about this very sensitive topic. I just want to acknowledge that for well over an hour now, we've been talking about something that is perhaps already traumatizing some of you on the line, because I don't know what your background is. And unless you have disclosed your background with others, they don't know what your background is. So I want to begin by saying this is very sensitive, and it's going to get more sensitive as I get into my presentation. So please bear with me. I also want to thank my co-panelists for leading up to a wonderful way to close out at least this section of the presentation by now talking about the impact that sexual harassment, domestic violence, and any kind of harassment amongst tenants can have on people. But I'm also going to introduce how it can affect us as the workers. But before going into this, I want you all to participate in an exercise with me. This is called a brain break. And we do need brain breaks. Brain breaks give us a moment to allow the hemispheres, the right and left hemispheres, to cross, to kind of bring us down from experiences where there may be high emotions running and we may not be aware of it. Sometimes we are, but other times we aren't. So this is what this is going to look like. I'm going to demonstrate first, and I'm going to ask you all to participate. Here's my cell phone. You could use a piece of paper, but I'm going to use my cell phone. And I'm going to raise it up, and then I'm going to turn it around as if, I'm a waiter. And then I'm going to raise my arm up and then bring my arm down. And then I'm going to switch hands. I'm going to turn it around as if I'm a waiter again, raise it up and lower. Okay, now let's do that 2 times. Start with your right hand, and you're going to turn the arm around as if you're carrying a tray or a plate to someone. Lift your arm. Very good, very good, very good. Lower. Yes. And now switch hands. Very good. And you're going to turn as if you're about to take this hot plate or something to somebody. Raise up and lower. One last time. Very good. And lift. Down. Switch hands. And now up and down. At this stage, you really shouldn't be thinking about what just happened before I came on the screen. You should be thinking now about, my brain is now clear, because I'm only going to get deeper into this. Trauma. Oh, Tamika, would you mind bringing up the screen?
Sure.
Thank you so much. Going to define what trauma is for us so that we're all starting with a common language. All right, you can skip to the next slide. Awesome. Trauma is an overriding emotional event involving deep distress, alarm, fear, or terror. So it's not just typical drama. It's something that's way deeper than that. And what's really important to note is that what is my trauma may not be your trauma. So you have to remain objective about that as opposed to being subjective and saying, well, that wasn't that bad. Well, that wasn't so bad for you. But for the person who has experienced trauma, it is indeed that bad for them. And another component of trauma is that it has this neuroelectrical jolt attached to it. Now let's just stay there for a few seconds, because what I'm highlighting for everyone is that trauma involves brain activity. An event occurred that was seared into a person's hippocampus, that's, our memory section of our brain and our limbic system, and the amygdala, where we store emotions, is also ignited and recalls from that moment forward that event in a significant way. So it wasn't, again, the lightweight event for that individual. It's something that's very serious for them. And for many of our victims of sexual harassment, I can assure you, it's not the first time that they have been sexually harassed in their lives. Oftentimes, these are individuals who have gone through this numerous times, or perhaps one time. And if it is the first time, now you're dealing with someone who's reaching out to you, who has no history of dealing with trauma, who's now in this new mental state that forever, when an event remotely similar to the traumatic event occurs, they will recall through their senses, because trauma is a physical experience, what happened. For example, if a song were playing, they'll remember that song. If there was a certain sound in the background, they'll remember that sound. If there was a certain scent, they'll recall the scent. The scent might not even be present if they are re-traumatized, but all of those sensory responses will return to them in the future when they're talking about the traumatic event. And they're not even going to relate to the experience in rational terms. So it's really important when we get to the part about how investigators interact with people who have been traumatized, that once someone becomes, as we call, dysregulated or very emotional about the conversation, what you shouldn't do, and I need you to write this down, do not ask them to calm down. If you ask them to calm down, you're probably going to lose them, because not only are you not relating to them in the moment, you're not understanding that literally their brains have become dysregulated. That is a particular brain state that a person is in. Rather, what you want to do is engage in active listening, where you listen well enough to say, I heard you say, or I understood that you just said. Repeat what they said, because at that point you want to get them to say yes. You want them at least to know that they have been heard. And listening to someone and acknowledging that they have been heard is not the same as saying, I agree with you. It's not the same. You're not saying, I agree with everything you said. Rather, you're just getting them to understand that you acknowledge what they just said. And that can help someone get more to that regulated state. And if you're unable to achieve that at that stage, you may have to ask them to get a glass of water. If you were with them, you could get the water for them. But if you're not with them, ask them to get a glass of water. Believe it or not, water helps to calm us. It's soothing, And in this environment, you may want to have water nearby, because by you drinking your own water, you may mirror to the person that this is what you need them to do right now. Model for them drinking water. So certain things that you want them to achieve, you can model for them. For example, taking a deep breath and nodding is a way to even model to someone that I actually need you to do that right now. So I'm going to do it for you, or ask them, to do this along with me to help them to become more regulated. In terms of the event may be perceived as inescapable, well, that's one of the reasons why an event is interpreted as trauma, is because in the moment it feels inescapable. Stella spoke to that earlier when she talked about, what choices does a mother have in January if we're talking about, frigid temperatures and there's no alternative housing available, or there's something else that is a struggle for her to consider in order to go into that new housing. So yeah, these are inescapable events inside of a person's mind. And as long as we're not projecting, what is our value system, but hearing what has happened to somebody else, that empathy that Melody alluded to, then we can take down their story. And in the course of that, Melody said this, if someone has experienced trauma or even sustained toxic stress that I'm going to go into in a moment, what they may not be able to do, and Adrienne said this too, is tell the story succinctly. It's going to be very hard because when trauma occurs, it changes the neuroelectrical pathways in the brain. The information is not going to go in succinctly. They will lose their ability to tell the story in chronological order. Oftentimes the first, second, or third time that they're trying to tell you the story. And for me, when I'm listening to someone and the more difficulty they have in telling the story, the more I'm convinced this person was traumatized. Like, okay, they're going to need more coaching. And I might have to give them an exercise, which is either alone, if you prefer that, or with your support system. Sit down and try to write about what happened, because the order may not come up right away. It may come up over time. And having the ability to speak fluidly is also disrupted in someone who has experienced trauma. So you really have to practice patience and bearing with them as they're trying to express themselves. And another nuance that's really important is sometimes if the complainant is a female, she may not want to talk to a male, and she may never say that directly. She may go along with, the interview, but hold back out of concern that if I really say what happened here, you'll judge me, or I am very uncomfortable with the language. Stella mentioned this earlier, because what I really need to say to you is so explicit, it makes me uncomfortable. Now, admittedly, with my background in counseling and therapy, I tell myself before I go into those kinds of questions with people, okay, it's time to switch into this really serious component of it so that I'm comfortable with saying explicit things, and always warn the person that you're about to say something extremely sensitive so that they're prepared for that. And, if I have to ask questions about, let's say it's a male, and this is a real story, by the way, a complainant who contacted the organization because she was sexually harassed by the maintenance worker who exposed himself to her. I had to find out from her about his penis. And before I said that to you, I prepared myself. Okay, you're getting ready to go into something, very sensitive that you're going to say to people publicly. I had to ask her, what did it look like? Because he mentioned to her that, was something significant about his size. And we needed to find out details, because those details were going to be important when the investigator connected with the complainant. Because if the investigator is going to do a thorough review of the investigation, then the investigator needs to ask questions about that as well. Because for me, it corroborated what was in the initial complaint. Let's get into sustained toxic stress. That is that low level below trauma for people. That's right below trauma, where many people live day in, day out. When Melody talked about race, it could be your gender, it could be your sexual identity, it could be something about you, that people see you differently or they interact with you differently. So sustained toxic stress or chronic toxic stress is important for us to note, because if people are living in environments or experiencing things that produce sustained or chronic toxic stress in their lives, it is very likely that they also have medical conditions that stem from that sustained chronic toxic stress. For example, hypertension, and then the diabetes, and perhaps renal failure and other kinds of chronic diseases. Asthma, can contribute to a child missing school or going to sleep in school and getting into trouble in class because they were too tired the night before to get, because of the asthma, they had interrupted sleep patterns and they're too tired the next day in class to be alert. And if the teacher does not understand that and instead disciplines a child, which happens all too often in many school systems, the child is only being punished for something that was stressful to the body and then became stressful to the mind and so forth. So, it doesn't always have to be trauma, but it could be sustained toxic stress. And let's look below in the block you see here. Events can be terrifying or subtler and insidious. So under terrifying, maybe, this is what someone considers traumatic, and that's all forms of abuse, assault, combat, disasters, terroristic attack, torture, violence, witnessing death, sexual harassment, domestic violence, tenant-on-tenant harassment. Again, it's up to the individual, not to us to decide what is traumatic. And then it could be about something that's subtler and insidious, bullying, dental procedure. My sister is in that field and says, we talk about this all the time, that there are people who've gone to the dental office and as a result of a negative experience, they won't return, will not return. Discrimination. Drug areas, in other words, communities that are infested with drug usage, drug sales, homelessness, hunger, poverty, witnessing rage. You talk about households where there's domestic violence going on, just being the witness of that. I went to Catholic school and I went at a time when nuns, and I'm kind of dating myself calling them nuns, when they would use yardsticks to discipline children. And there was one young lady in my classroom in the first grade who was disciplined every day after lunch. It was just something about her and that nun. And watching her being beat with that yardstick every day would frighten me. I mean, I would literally jump every time she would get hit with that yardstick. And I could feel that in my stomach. I never got hit with a yardstick, in part because I watched her, but it was so disturbing watching that young lady be hit every day. And I'm much older, and I remember in my mind's eye, like I mentioned to you earlier, the neuroelectrical jolt. I can still recall what it was like to be in that classroom as a first grader and seeing that grown woman hit that young lady with that yardstick and seeing her uniform, what I would call whip in the wind, as she would pull back that yardstick from that young lady. And sexual harassment and other examples of things that I could mention, but I'll move on. And then last but not least, it's powerful sensory memories are created, which leads to change in the neurological landscape through fight, flight, freeze, submit, capitulation. Again, we're not going to impose how we would handle a situation on a complainant. It's what this complainant's story is. They're telling you that, I fought back. And even if they fought back, it doesn't mean you can't be traumatized. Or there was flight, or they froze, submitted, capitulated. It doesn't matter. It is what it is for the individual. And just to say a bit more about that, in terms of complainants, it's important to remember that they can be confused while they're trying to tell the story. So aside from losing track of time, not being able to, flow with their words, they can be very confused. They can be concerned about being judged. So it's important to demonstrate that you're not going to judge them while they're trying to explain things. And we need to interact. They may have to interact with you while being in the presence of a support person. That could be a fair housing advocate from a FIT program. It could be, a friend, a mother, or any person, but they may need to have that person present. So we'll have to exhibit some understanding if that's something that they convey to us. Now I'm going to switch over to investigators, because in order to do this work, it's important to note that we have to be mindful of our own emotional states, our own emotional intelligence. It's not possible to like everything about what we do. It might be the very reason why you do the work in the first place. You don't like discrimination, so that's what keeps you coming back each and every day. But it might be other times when you're interacting with people, and sometimes it could be, a victim of domestic violence, because there could be a judgment inside of you that you're out of touch with, or a person who has experienced sexual harassment. And again, there could be something deep seated inside of us, because if you think about the iceberg, what we present to the world is the top of that iceberg, but what's below the water, which is really, the long part of that iceberg, that's the real us. And that stuff has a way of showing up whether we believe it or not. When others interact with us, they see the bottom of that iceberg. So we have to be aware of our own emotional intelligence to check in with ourselves about our attitudes, our ideas, and our behaviors. Meaning, what do we do? What do we tend to do? Because we're all influenced by our attitudes, ideas, and behaviors. But the good news is that through training, we become aware of these things that are below the surface inside of us, so that we can show up as that neutral fact finder, because that's really important for the complainant at that stage. And it's also important that we understand all of this, because it's going to impact the outcome of the investigation. In other words, if our attitude about people that experience sexual harassment, domestic violence, or tenant-on-tenant harassment is negative, that'll show up in the outcome. It'll show up in the amount or lack of effort that we put into the investigation. And it's okay to acknowledge that that's the case that you don't want to get to right away. It's okay to admit that, because at least that's the level of awareness that you have about that case. What's important is, what do you do about that? Because you might discover while, thinking about this, or talking to a supervisor or a colleague or somebody else who has training in this area, oh my goodness, I had no idea that the reason why that case or these types of cases bother me is because I had a friend who had an experience, or I forgot about whatever that happened to me, or something along those lines. Trauma training is really important for all of us, because it helps to raise our awareness overall, so that we put on our trauma lenses, if you will, so that we become more trauma competent, so that we become more trauma informed and more trauma sensitive about what's going on. And again, if you're thinking, oh, this stuff really doesn't traumatize anybody, that's your perspective. That's not what's happening to other people. And when you're showing up, you have to show up for other people. You have to meet the complainants where they are in order to be able to do effective investigative work. It's important that we all have safety plans, because if we ourselves are experiencing vicarious trauma in this space, and it can happen. You can get on the phone with someone, Adrienne mentioned, for 35 minutes. It could be 45, sometimes it's an hour, and by the time you're off the phone, you feel like you're punch drunk. What's your safety plan? What do you already have in place that you do when you know you are tapped out? Is it a brisk walk? Is it an exercise, like a demonstrated change in the hemispheres, how the activity is going on inside of your brain? Is it deep breathing? Is it meditation? Is it running? Whatever it is, You have to figure out what your safety plan is, because you may have to execute your safety plan after having a conversation with somebody. And then, you know, on the state level, there's the SEAP program. So you might have to take advantage of your SEAP program. And there's nothing weak about that. That is you taking care of yourself. And that means that you'll show up each day for your work as well as home, and your life overall being the best you. And it's also important that when you're doing the investigation, you're asking, as Melody said, the right questions. And the right question is not to the respondent, did you do it? Alone. That's not just the right, that, yeah, okay, fine. You might ask that question, but you have to ask follow-up questions. And some of those follow-up questions may be very invasive, because the way I see it as a FIP who's helping someone through this process, when I get your complaint from you, that's your narrative. And I'm hoping that the investigation can corroborate that narrative. For example, if someone tells, and this actually happened, a complainant tells me that the person who sexually harassed her told her, you know, that he had a huge penis, and then showed her his penis. I need to warn her, when we're talking, I'm going to ask you very sensitive questions about what you just stated. And tell me, when he exposed himself to you, what did you remember seeing? Because there could be a difference in the color of, you know, the person's hair on their head and the hair, their pubic hair. Was there a birthmark in that area? Did you see anything on their thighs? You know, was the size of the penis large? You know, things of, I need to find that out, because when the investigation ensues, we need to know that those questions were asked at some juncture. We need to know about the body. Did you see tattoos on the upper body or arm, or, you know, wherever, or especially in places that are, you know, not in the neck or the hand, but in the more intimate parts of a person's body. So I will close with just reminding us all that this is very sensitive work that we're doing, especially when we delve into topics around sexual harassment, domestic violence, tenant on tenant harassment. And we need to check in with ourselves to be aware of what are we thinking and feeling prior to, during, and even after those moments, so that we can show up for our clients and meet them where they are, in order to achieve social justice when, in fact, it is possible under these difficult circumstances. So I'm going to end right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Very important. I appreciate the exercise before your participation, because it did kind of recenter me. I felt myself kind of on edge. I was getting really into the subject matter, and I was able to relax after that. I could feel the relaxation. So I really do appreciate that moment of pause. And I got to tell you, it's important. We today, if you're feeling kind of pent up because of this subject matter, if you're feeling some kind of way, as they say, it's probably just the effect of dealing on something on such a level. And this is our job. This is our job. Those of us that are housing advocates, those of us that are in the investigations realm, those of us that are FAPs and FIPs and you know, property owners, you know, this is something we have to deal with. Property owners and property managers, they have to deal with this because this is part of their business. And the more they know about this, the more they're going to be successful in their day-to-day business. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jody so that she can get some audience questions.
Sorry, I was muted there. I want to thank you, ladies. Women. I've been in the PHRC for 21 years and have gone through so many trainings, but I would tell you I have been very informed today and very grateful to be part of the panel. At this particular time, we're going to ask for questions from the audience, you know, staff, whomever has questions at this time for any of our panelists. I would actually like to start with a question for Megan. As being a fellow domestic violence, advocate, Megan, I served with Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh for 7 years in their legal department. One of the issues that was most seen was how the police also sexual harass women when they're calling to have their abusers arrested, and it's almost the re-victimizing the victim. So I wanted to know, is there any kind of plans in terms of training for the police officers? We had one case in our region in particular where the landlord, it was a quid pro quo. Afterwards, she called the police, and the police stated that they could arrest her for prostitution. So I'm just wondering if there's any type of plan or any future training with police officers as well as sexual harassment in housing and with victims of domestic violence.
You raise a lot of points at once, and we all understand how layered all these conversations are. I will say, to touch back on what Melody's point was in her presentation, is what is crucial for us is our interagency connections. And so we have a very close relationship with the Women's Center, very close relationship with SHIMS, with the Jewish Family and Children's Services, with the services that these women and other survivors are accessing. And so we recognize at FHP that what our job and our role is to make the fair housing case and win it. And so we then have very close referral connections, so they're a warm referral, not just a cold drop off, to get our clients to the other resources that will help with, whether it's payment, whether it's other social services, whether it's, transitional housing. And so that way they're with the right people who can serve the individual specific needs that they have. To your point about police, now you understand that a fair housing case is going to require a housing contract that's related to it. So it's interesting you raise the police, because I will say we are preparing a file for administrative complaint in which we will be filing against a municipality and its police department, because the police department has been given the ordinance in which to enact housing policy in this municipality in Western Pennsylvania. And so with the housing connection, we'll certainly be involved. But what I will say is that FHP was awarded an EOI, an outreach grant, in our FIT funds. And so we are currently in the development of the domestic violence fact sheet, domestic violence, social media outreach that is very specific and targeted. And I think your concept and idea of trying to broaden that to bring that awareness to the police departments as well would be a wonderful idea that we don't already have in the list of those connections. And so I think we'll certainly reach back out and coordinate as ways to, as you understand, in Western Pennsylvania, it's all about who you know and connections in order to get into places, and any help in making sure that we can get this information out to the right people in order to make true and actual change. And I'll say, one other point to that end is I hesitate to share the article because of how explicit it is. I hold so much respect for the work that HUD and DOJ has done for sexual harassment in West Virginia. I'm not sure if anyone here is aware of the 2018 case in Castle Shannon out here in Western Pennsylvania. I raised it in my presentation when we talked about sexual harassment in housing. And I hold myself responsible for not getting the word out in the greater Pittsburgh region better for this woman to know to report this in a civil means within fair housing and civil rights. Because I will say, to the conversation about how we're doing these investigations, what she did was she installed a camera in her unit and caught the landlord on camera in her unit doing a sexually explicit act. And he was held accountable by the criminal court for 6 months of house arrest. But she now has no sense of safety, to Angela's point, in her own home. And that 6 months of house arrest does nothing to mitigate and alleviate what she went through in that trauma of identifying that there was a reason to put security cameras in her own home. So I will share the link if anyone has not seen this Castle Shannon incident from 2018 in terms of what we need to do in Pennsylvania to get these cases reported so we can adjudicate them and hold these housing providers responsible.
So Ms. Bradley, Melody speaking again, just to add to Megan's comments, we are working in tandem with the AUSA's office. Jacqueline Romero is our point of contact, quite frankly, and we've done roundtables throughout the region. So pre-pandemic, we pulled those stakeholders in to a room and had this discussion about sexual harassment, how it happens, who are the perpetrators, what our processes are, how complaints can be filed. So that committee still exists, just in a different way. And so we have not been able to regalvanize around being able to pull those folks back together in a virtual environment, but that committee does exist. In fact, Chad and I did a quick exchange, and I'm going to make sure that he and Adrian are part of the committee as well. And so when we are able to regroup and regather ourselves, that it'll be a full regional approach.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's
And
all I have.
thank you. And it's Angela. I'd just like to mention in Philadelphia, I have reached out to the Philadelphia Police Department and the Sheriff's Office because both entities could use sexual harassment training. We were looking at moving forward. Unfortunately, you know that in recent weeks, we had a police shooting in Philadelphia and a lot of social unrest emerged. But yes, that is something that FHRC in Philly is very aware of, and we're interested in working with our police partners because we know that there are times when it can have a civil rights as well as criminal component to these cases, and we want to be prepared.
Good.
I had a question for anyone on the panel. How ready do we believe the magistrate's office are to deal with what's coming down the pike, you know, the lifting of the CDC moratorium, and some of the, because I know that in some areas, some magistrates that I've heard of, they only want to address the one issue. So they're not interested in the trauma behind. No, you're here because you didn't pay your rent, and that's the end of it. How ready do we believe magistrates are, and what's the best way to get in front of them? Because I've not gotten the warm and fuzzies from some of the people that I've tried to reach out to.
It's a tough nut to crack, just to put it simply. And I think that's where it's going to take a lot of coordination, you know, with your AG's office, and even reaching out to the governor and other folks, you know, from Department of Community Economic Development, you know, just getting the magistrates to see that it's more than just simply PHRC, the fair housing groups in the Commonwealth that are concerned about this, but how big this problem is. And, you know, underlying a lot of this, we have many conflicts of interest, because you have people who will be deciding cases who are also property owners. So some of the resistance that we're witnessing has to do with people who are looking out for their own interests and not necessarily that of others. So that's another, you know, issue as far as I'm concerned on the frontier as advocates that we really have to put front and center with the public, because, you know, how can we ask someone, for example, if mortgage-backed securities is what judges in Philadelphia's pension is dependent on, and they're presiding over foreclosure cases?
And Adrian, I'll pop in to say that, as we have discussed before, I think what we can continue to collaborate on outside of this conversation is understanding how we can have fair housing cases moved out of the magistrate lens. As we all may have seen and experienced, is that having the fair housing back pattern in front of the magistrate is not helpful in our process and our shared goals, as well as for that tenant efforts or homeowners efforts in order to adjudicate civil rights. And to that end is that in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, there was a mediation pilot set up for landlord tenant that was started pre-pandemic, but in that structure with a agreeable magistrate, we established fair housing referrals and fair housing information for the mediators to identify fair housing outside of landlord tenant for what's appropriate to be in front of the magistrate and what's not. So we're always welcome to continue that conversation and work together towards that. because I agree with you and with Angela that coordinated efforts in Pennsylvania is crucial.
Sarah Pratt did a training, I believe it was May or June, with the Philadelphia Bar Association. So I encourage that, we schedule more trainings and have facilitators like Sarah Pratt, Stella Adams, and others who can, help magistrates see that, in some instances, there's opportunity to exercise fair housing laws. I'm a huge proponent of reasonable accommodation. And if that's an option that people are unaware of, it's something that they can't consider. So, let's do more to get education for the magistrates, even our attorneys that are going to represent people in landlord-tenant court, and ensure that they're looking at all of the tools that are available to them, as opposed to just, let's go cut a deal that's going to result in an eviction, and that's going to leave something on the individual's record that's going to make it more difficult for them to secure housing moving forward.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Melody, I have a question in terms of the investigators. And we're looking at, and perhaps you can give some tools, and maybe this is a conversation you and I can have further later on, regarding on-site visits in the technical world due to the pandemic. We can't do on-site visits. So, can you give a word to the investigators in terms of what the workaround may be?
So we internally have been using these platforms, Zoom and Teams. We are conducting conciliations using Zoom and Teams. You can set up meeting rooms where you can actually shuttle diplomacy. You're, being able to, have consensus and those kinds of things. So we're doing that. I just had a call with my investigators this morning on the secretary initiated complaint that we have, and leveraging other people on the ground. We're considering a third-party entity. It may create where you have to create some contract vehicles where there are investigative agencies that can go out. It may require that an agency enter into a contract to have other third-party investigators go on site and do some of the work that we can't do because we're state and federal agencies, and there are many unions and things that preclude us from doing certain things. So we're going to have to really go into this next year being innovative and thinking through alternative ways where we may again have to use third-party entities to go on site. And then again, the acquisition of Westlaw, more expanded services with systems that allow you to do background checks to get numbers and addresses for people. And then you're able to follow up in other ways. So we're thinking through those kinds of things.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Concerns, comments?
Yeah, I think we're at the 2 o'clock hour. Do
Yes,
we have any more questions or comments before we conclude?
I don't think so.
Okay, let's once again thank all of the panelists. Just some high level information, leaving us not just charged and inspired, but with a wealth of information. One of the things I just wanted to add to the context is that one of the things that occurs between Melanie, Stella, and certainly Angela and myself is this whole concept around the very moment that we find ourselves in. You don't have to look at the footages of unarmed or even at times state violence or armed people being killed by the state. There are neurotransmitters, as Angela spoke about, that can activate a vicarious traumatization. The work that we do is very important work, but we can turn off the television. That's one of the therapeutic things that we can do. In the city of Philadelphia, I oftentimes think about the Philadelphia regional office as I do all of the offices, but the most recent killing of Walter Wallace Jr. had an intersectionality of a lot of the things that we heard on this call today with these brilliant panelists. We had the mental health system. We had police investigations. We had a lot of challenges in that particular community. And so when we look at the landscape of everything that we're dealing with, food deserts that already existed, pharmacy deserts that already existed, and then not looting, but we focus on that, but not the thing that led to the trigger that put us in those positions. Let's just take care of our emotional selves. At PHRC, we know that we have industrial social workers. We call them SEEP. If you need to go ahead and speak to them, please do, because the work is challenging. And then in our personal lives, we have multiple identities. We just don't work for our respective agencies. We are human beings who may be impacted by a loved one who may have coronavirus, a family, whatever, a community person, as well as this new normal, trying to navigate and balance these multiple identities for those of us who are working at home with significant others, working with children, along with all of the noise that we're hearing in our democracy. So please take care of yourselves. Vacation days, let's take them if we can. If you have them, take them, because we don't want anyone being so stressed out. You can't take them with you when you eventually go, right? So the whole aspect of just making sure that we talk through this, and whatever your system is with regards to your support system, utilize those systems, utilize your regional directors, utilize your the colleagues of yours that you have familiarity with, but also those individuals who may be new to the commission. Not saying that you break boundary issues, but there are times where you should be trying to speak to people about not just the work, but life is not either or, it's both and, both the work and our regular lives. This is a daunting task that all of us are undertaking, and we're not so certain how long we're going to be doing teleworking in the manner that we're doing it. So once again, I want to thank all of the panelists. You inspired us. For you all, continue to aspire to greater heights. And I saw Marcia Barry and some of our members of our advisory council, as well as our human relations commissions and other stakeholders. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it, and have a good day.
You as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.